Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Delighted to have you here tonight for our forward evening book talk for the month of February, George Washington's birthday month. And tonight we're going to learn about George Washington's hair, not quite as literally as all that. We'll take it far beyond his actual hair to look at the idea of George Washington's hair and the way in which it helped people connect to someone long gone. Before we get into the conversation tonight with Keith Beutler, I want to thank the Ford Motor Company for sponsoring this event, as they do every month, a free and engaging book talk. Next month, we'll be returning in person at the Smith Theater to have a great conversation with Holly Mayer with her new book called Congress's Own, A Canadian Regiment, the Continental Army, and American Union. That'll be on March 29th. I also want to highlight one important lecture series we have just around the corner. Tickets are available now. This will come not just with a lecture, but also with a reception and a book signing to follow. We have three great scholars coming across the months of March, April, and May. We have Bruce Ragsdale with his fabulous new book, Washington at the Plow. We have Joseph Ellis with his great new book on the American Revolution, The Cause. And we have Mary Sarah Builder with her wonderful book called Female Genius, exploring George Washington and Eliza Harriet, this remarkable female lecturer right at the time of the Constitutional Convention. It's a great and engaging story that helps us better understand the world of George Washington. But tonight, we have a great conversation with Keith Beutler, who's a professor of history at Missouri Baptist University in St. Louis. He earned his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, as did I. He earned his PhD in 2005 and has been putting together this remarkable book on memory and the founding that we'll discuss tonight. George Washington's Hair, How Early Americans Remembered the Founders, fresh out from the University of Virginia Press. Join me, Keith, and let's dive into this book.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Thanks, Keith. You're coming to us from St. Louis, correct?
Correct, yes.
Great. Well, I'm in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and we're streaming around the country and excited to dive into this. There's a place I suggested perhaps we might begin because this is a book about memory and in a very actual sense about, I think a lot of people know the word mnemonics, right? The science of memory. And there's this great story that you dive into in the introduction of this Greek fellow named Simonides.
Yes.
Does that sound familiar? Could you tell us that story?
Absolutely.
This great story out of antiquity.
Thank you, Kevin. So early Americans were generally familiar with a lot of stories from the Greco-Roman world. And one of those was the story of Simonides of Chios. And in particular, what was famous about him was that he had, or so the story went, been in a dining hall when the roof of the building collapsed and killed almost everyone inside, himself being one of the survivors. And later, when they were trying to identify the victims, he used a mnemonic trick. He thought of, where he was, and then he thought of the person next to him and the person next to them, and so on and so forth, and went around the banquet hall. And what people deduced from that, the reason the story was told so often, was that they reasoned from it that contiguity and physical localized memory is important for remembering things. Now, importantly, over the centuries, as people told this story in the Western world, the pendulum shifted back and forth between a physicalist view that said you should actually have, real physical objects located in your mind that you should look at, and a more abstract view. The more abstract view had prevailed in the United States until about 1790. And that's where we pick up in the book as the physicalist view begins to gain currency.
And so what does that look like? You say a physicalist approach to memory. It's connecting to something obviously physical, but talk me through an example.
Absolutely. So in this period between 1790 and 1840, you get what I call in the book the physicalist turn in mnemonics, where commentators increasingly say that we know, and they will increasingly say we know through modern science in the period, we know that memory is something that has to be anchored with material artifacts, that memory leans on the material world. And that emphasis, when applied to trying to remember the American Revolution, is going to be part and parcel to a sort of frenzy in American culture all through that period to grab physical props by which we can anchor our memories of the American Revolution and founding. Artifacts, relics, and even veterans of the Revolution themselves in bodily, form.
So I want to encourage everyone out there while you're watching that you can be posting your questions because I like to bring your questions to our guest as soon as I can. And then, of course, we'll have plenty of time at the end, too, to really dive into some audience questions. So please be submitting questions on this idea of better understanding how the founding generation and the generations to follow, most importantly, understood memory and how they could possibly connect and have a recall of this bygone time. Okay, so we're getting a sense of a physicalist approach to memory, connecting it to a physical object as a way of making it possible. Can you give us someone to connect with since we're trying to understand this? Who's a good example of this physicalist turn?
Charles Willson Peale is a great example. So let's pull up the slide, if you would, of Charles Willson Peale. This is his famous self-portrait, the artist in his museum. And we're looking at the area that is on the second floor, even today, of Independence Hall, the Long Gallery, it's still called. And Peale founded the first museum of American history in that space. And what you're looking at, as he allows us to peek behind the curtain, is you're looking at all these little cubicles. And he has all sorts of animals that he has taxidermically preserved in the majority of those cubicles. But if you look at the very top, just where the curtain is beginning to pull away, you can see a portrait there. And in fact, then if you look beyond the curtain around the upper part of the room, you will see that these are portraits of the founding fathers. The one at the very beginning there is George Washington. And what Peale is doing with this arrangement is he's creating a memory palace, is the term that many people use, hearkening back to the story of Simonides and really trying to create an orderly presentation, spatially organized, of remembrance of the founders at the very top. And then we might wonder, well, why are the animals taxidermically preserved below? It's because he's creating a great chain of being. And the animals are American, animals indigenous to North America. And the story he's telling is that there is a great chain of being, the term of the day, going all the way from simpler animals to the founding fathers at the top. And he's doing a lot of things, but among those is he's trying to rebut philosophes in France, for example, like Buffon, who had said that the American physical environment was inferior and created diminutive, creatures, inferior creatures. And he's saying, no, that's not true at all. So we see a portion of a mastodon down at the bottom there at the right, if you're looking at the image. And what he's communicating there is that America has very large, powerful animals, but that the progression goes all the way to the pinnacle of the founding fathers. This is communicating a very elite, by the way, view of memory of the American Revolution, where the generals are on top, and of course, the general of all, George Washington. Later, we're going to see that other Americans are going to take advantage of the physicalist turn to insert average folks themselves, in many cases, into the narrative. But this is what's going to prevail until about 1820, this kind of elite narrative.
Many of us at Mount Vernon know Charles Willson Peale as a great portraitist himself. In fact, the very first portrait of George Washington ever painted is by Peale in 1772. So he takes his artistry and then expands it to think about building a sort of a physical collection to better tell the stories.
Yes, and he is dead serious about the physicalist side of this. I mean, so much so that Peale is going to end up regretting that he, as a taxidermist as well as an artist, had not persuaded, as he intended to do, Benjamin Franklin to allow him to taxiderm Franklin himself. He had actually taxidermically preserved Franklin's rabbit, and then Franklin died, and Peale lamented for a long time that he had not approached Franklin with the offer to preserve him taxidermically. And he hoped then that if Franklin had bought into it, he thought, maybe Franklin would, as a man of science, that he could use Franklin's cachet to try to convince the other leading founders to undergo this as well. I'll editorialize and say I'm glad this didn't work out.
That's amazing. So, so as best we know, he never broached the subject with Ben Franklin.
No, he did not get to that point, but he regretted the fact that he didn't. And Peale is going to bring to this analysis and this presentation really strong, to his thinking, scientific theory. In particular, that of Johann Caspar Lavater, the Swiss clergyman who becomes known in the 18th century for his views of physiognomy. And the idea of physiognomy is that you can tell people's character by examining, by synecdoche, discrete parts of their body, by learning to read those correctly, including, Lavater emphasizes, a lock of one's hair. He says, by the hair alone, we may know the man. And following in this vein, Peale passes this vision on as he gets older to his sons, including Rembrandt Peale, who's also a prominent portraitist, who's going to take it upon himself to try to paint, the ultimate portrait, the standard likeness, he calls it, of George Washington. And Rembrandt is going to mix with the Lavaterian emphasis along those lines. Rembrandt is actually going to go so far as to claim that he was able to look at George Washington before Washington had powdered his hair so that he could get the hair, it being so indicative of character, just right. But then as we are getting then into the 1820s and 30s with the son, with Rembrandt Peale, we see the rise in science, or pseudoscience, we might say, but many people thought it was science, of phrenology, where people thought that they could, I have kind of a bumpy head myself, and people thought that they could read character out of the protuberances on the head. They had a developing theory of brain localization, and they thought that this would correspond with bumps within the brain itself, and that if you learn to read the topography of people's skull, you can read out the strengths of different parts of their brain, reflective of different aspects of their character. And so Rembrandt Peale is going to take great pride in rendering the skull of each founder, but particularly, as he emphasizes, Washington for phrenological analysis ever after.
Amazing. We have a question coming in from the audience. Paul is actually curious for you to tell a little bit more about the portrait we're looking at here, the self-portrait of Charles Willson Peale. Sure. He's curious what the other foreground object is. You mentioned a mastodon bone, the foreground on our left. He's curious about. But also, if you could just tell a little bit more about what we should see when we look at this really iconic portrait of someone.
Sure. No, that's great. It's a turkey is the other creature that we see there, and I think the emphasis, I don't recall that Peale actually, wrote this, but what I read out of that is an emphasis again on American species. Remember that Ben Franklin for a while wanted the turkey to be the American national bird because, it was seen as an indigenous American creature and large, in some respects, which was part of Peale's story that American forms, creatures, including the founding fathers, are not diminutive. You can also see, if you look up near, just below George Washington, not coincidentally, you can see a bald eagle. So he transitions, from animals, the symbol of the United States, to Washington himself. And then deep in the picture, you can see, various people in his museum, including, I think this is significant, including a woman. And so Peale is in an age where, women previously weren't always in view, when it came to educative enterprises. I think what Peale's communicating here, because certainly he wrote a lot about this, is that he wanted his museum to be open to all sorts of people of every gender and people of every class. There's a little bit, though, of a dark side to this, because Peale had a device that you're not seeing in the picture, but a physionotrace, he called it, after Lavater's idea of physiognomy, reading character out of people's bodies. And this was a device for creating silhouette images of people. And they would have people, pose in front of this. They would draw out the silhouette and cut it out of paper. And they cut it out of double paper so that the person could go away with their own silhouette, and also so that Peale could archive a copy of it. And Peel loved going through those. Eventually, he had thousands of them, and classifying people as to where he thought, by their silhouette alone, they fit in the great chain of being. And he wrote that he hoped that people would also classify themselves and learn their place, which was clearly to be, as they were in the museum, standing literally beneath the founders. So, he doesn't buy into his friend Thomas Jefferson's more egalitarian hopes for America. Peel is trying to defend a more stratified view of society.
Wow. There's another element to your story, and before we get too far, obviously we're going to come back to George Washington's hair. But there's another element in addition to Peel's museum, and that's the creation of historical organizations at this time. You and I have spent many, because we're both historians, we've spent many a day in places like the New York Historical Society, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and so on. Can you talk to us about the origins of those institutions at exactly this time and how it fits into your story?
Excellent. No, I appreciate it. So if we could pull up the next slide, the second slide, which is what you're looking at there. The person in the center of that image is John Fanning Watson. And Watson was a very eclectic person. He was a banker by day, but an antiquarian, every moment he could squeeze in. And he was one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, one of these societies. And as you're pointing out, Kevin, the Historical Society movement really begins in this period that I'm treating in the book, between 1790 and 1840, begins in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Historical Society, but then others follow. And if you look to his left, as you're looking straight on at the photograph, you see there his memory box. And this is essentially, another term that people would use for this sort of thing is a cabinet of curiosities. And he has a combination of texts in it, things written down. You can see some of that. And he has artifacts. And one of his favorite artifacts was a lock of George Washington's hair. And he was really arranging these in his memory box, rather like Peel, to tell a story about the organization of the world, again, with the founders having pride of place in that story, and upper class people like him, coming in a relatively close second. If you look on the other side of him, you see there the manuscript edition of his Annals of Philadelphia, which is frankly a fascinating book even today to read. It's been republished many times. And it is as quirky as it turns out John Fanning Watson was himself. I mean, it's just a menagerie of tidbits about Philadelphia. But he made it a point to deposit with the Historical Society, with the Pennsylvania Historical Society that he helped to found, this manuscript edition that you see here. And even to this day, if you get a reprinting of John Fanning Watson's book, there's a section of the book where he tells you the page numbers of this thing that you're seeing here, this extra illustrated original with his own handwriting and actual artifacts. And he says, go to the Pennsylvania Historical Society. You can see this for yourself. He also deposited a similar book and gives the numbers for the pages of that in his annals as well, with the library company that to this day is still next door. And the system still works. I mean, literally, what I did in this case was I looked in Watson's book, and he said, if you go to this page, you're going to see in the bottom left a black swath of velvet. And this will be from a coat that was owned by Benjamin Franklin. And you can see it right there. And you can see in Watson's handwriting that he indicates what that is. So he's really bridging a gap, as the historical societies did. It wasn't just Watson who had, the memory box. Historical societies in this period are going to very pointedly have their own sorts of cabinets of curiosity. And then they're going to juxtapose very deliberately texts and artifacts. And they're going to treat the texts themselves as relics. But then again, consistent with this physicalist view of memory, which they will very self-consciously talk about. Watson is voluminous on this connection. They are going to say, a la the new science of memory, they see it as new, we have to have these things. And in other words, I think what people like him were saying is, we're not just exotic collectors. This is science, And also, I get the sense that he was a very militant Protestant. One of the things we could talk about is Protestants collected a lot of relics in this period. America was, of course, fairly dominantly Protestant in its religious culture, and the science of memory that it was said promoted the need for physical props sort of gave them cover to collect relics while claiming that they weren't doing anything like medieval Catholics who might collect pieces of the true cross, for example.
There were some Catholics in America. Did anyone call them on this, on the strange?
Yes, no, that's wonderful. In fact, this is, how it is, Kevin, when you're researching something and A appears to be true and B appears to be true, and both are, very current in the culture, and you theorize, if I've got this right, A and B are going to collide at some point. Well, I'm doing all this stuff about many people that collected locks of Washington's hair in the period. His family dispersed these. And one of my theories was that if I've got this right, this connection to the debate about Protestants and Catholic relics, that Catholics are going to, as you say, call them out. And they did. I actually found 3 separate occasions in this period where Catholic writers specifically said, this is amazing. You people collect locks of Washington's hair, but you won't allow us to have, the bones of Peter or some such thing. They called them out squarely on it, just as you suspected.
There's so much more we're going to get into, but I think maybe I will take us back to the title of George Washington's hair, because you've already made multiple references to locks of his hair out there in the world. And I just have to ask you, and now as the world's leading expert of this, what is the scope and scale of George Washington's hair out there in the world? What have you learned? How can you help us understand what's out there?
This is very surprising every day still to me. All right. Now, first of all, there are many, many purported locks of his hair in circulation. And a surprising number of these have convincing enough provenances, documentary and other trails, that people pay stunning sums for them. Recently, a Google executive spent many thousands of dollars buying a putative lock of Washington's hair. Mount Vernon, as you may know, has 60 purported locks of Washington's hair. And I spent a few days looking through all of your records, and Mount Vernon would be the first to say, some have better provenances than others. But the amazing thing, I think, here is that by the normal standards that we bring to this kind of thing as historians, any way you slice this or cut it, if you will, there are a lot of actual locks of his hair. I mean, I can look at the correspondence within Washington's family, sort of the original household, and then extending outward after his death. You can trace correspondence coming and going, and the family very quickly is dispersing locks of his hair. He does this to some extent during his lifetime, but in after years, the family seems to do it increasingly, even as a form of political patronage. And so it becomes, to an extent, politicized. And it's remarkable. If you were to go to my website, and I don't know if we're going to pull that up here or not, but it's an easy to remember URL, georgewashingtonshair.com. And if we scroll down a little bit on the website there, you can see where I say on the right-hand side there, navigate to the nearest lock of George Washington's hair. And this is my attempt at creating an app, essentially online, such that it's in Google Maps. And if you zoom in on it, or if you go full screen, it's very granular. I take you to more than 100. Currently, I'm up to 116 libraries, museums, universities, repositories like Mount Vernon, historical societies that have purported locks of Washington's hair. And on the map, I don't out any private collectors. So these are just, sort of public institutions. And again, right now I've charted 116. And if you go in onto, for example, like Long Island in New York, or if you go into, Boston or Philadelphia, I mean, it's really surprising sometimes how many of these are there. But even in St. Louis, we have a lock actually, and at the Missouri Historical Society on Stinker Boulevard near Wash U. And it was given by a former board member at Wash U in the 19-teens who was a Washingtonophile who bought autographed manuscripts of Washington and a lock of his hair. It's remarkable stuff. It really is.
Yeah, Bob from the audience has a great question. How common was it for famous Americans in this period to give locks of their hair to, as he says, to establish a permanent place in future society, sort of outlive themselves? So are there others? Is Washington far and away the most common, or are there others that are just like that?
Both of those things are true. So to answer the question in order, there were other Americans who gave their hair, you might say, for public purposes. I'll get to that in a moment. But to the second thing that you said, absolutely, Washington is far and away the most popular such case in, as far as I can tell, all of American history and maybe even world history. You know, I think there are a lot of purported extant locks of hair of the Buddha. I can't really speak to that scene very well. But with possibly that exception, I think even globally, Washington is otherwise a singularity on this subject. As far as other people giving their hair, and I love the way that question was framed, for, you might say, public purposes, you know, of leaving their mark in history, not just giving a token to their family. The person who did the most with that in the period that I looked at was Peter Errol Brown. And he was a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And he was obsessed with the idea that you could read human character from hair. He wrote to the families of the first 15 presidents of the United States. Brown himself died in 1860, so he didn't get Abraham Lincoln's hair, but he got hair of every other president. And I've seen his collection in person. He put the hair of the presidents in what he called his presidential hair pile. It's actually a book, a view book, in which he has a page devoted to each president with a lock of their hair there, and then a lithograph so you can see the image of the person. And he kept, you know, all the letters to the families, copied, you know, the letters that he sent, kept the letters from families, and it checks out, you know, with the family's own collections and records. It's astonishing that he did this. But other people, he's going to solicit hair, for example, from Charles Wilson Peel, you know, and he's also going to collect hair from insane asylum inmates, from people of various races. Now, he's a bigot, you know, and so he thinks that he can build an algorithm essentially to use the tensile strength of hair, and he develops devices for testing that. Of people to show where they are on the great chain of being. He's from that, you know, even more so the elite school that we talked about when we talked about Peel of memory. And it's really, it ends up getting rather depressing. And I had theorized, you know, as I was doing this work, that sooner or later I was going to find some, you know, horrible person who was going to take a lock of Washington's hair and use it to try to support, you know, quote unquote scientific racism, given the prevalence of that horror in the period. And that is exactly what he did. In 1849, he gave a talk and he published illustrations in which he took, you know, sample size 1, a lock of George Washington's hair, had Washington stand for all Caucasians, and took a lock of hair from a Native American, had that person stand for all Native American peoples, and a lock of hair from a person of African descent, had that person stand for all people of African descent. And then, in the most circular way you can imagine, with, you know, sample size 1, sample size 1, sample size 1, he dubbed Washington's hair, surprise, the ideal. And by extension, he said it reflected the humanity, the perfection of humanity of all people like himself who were Caucasian. And he said horrible things, actually. He likened the hair, for example, of the person of African descent to the wool of animals. It's not something I would want to say. It's a terrible thing to say. But the thing about this is he was taken very seriously, not just at the Academy of Natural Sciences, but in the wider scientific, you know, pseudo-scientific, certainly, world. And that research that he did, that garbage, appears in American science journals here and there into the 1930s. So it was used to underwrite, you know, in that sense, Washington's hair itself is used to underwrite racism in the dominant culture. It's a sad story.
It's fascinating the ways that story spins out across the 19th century and into the 20th. And of course, it's a 21st century story too, when you look at your map and see where these things are. But I want to take us back to the memory of the founding itself, the founding era. And your book does a better job than any I can think of at grappling with the something that I've long associated with Abraham Lincoln in his famous Lyceum address in 1838. This idea that Lincoln beautifully describes that the living veterans that you might have in your hometown, who by this point are ancient, are that connection to this bygone moment. And so the physical memory that you're describing in the body of these veterans, and of course, by the time Lincoln is writing, they're almost all gone.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the lives of these veterans of the war and how this shapes our story, what you're exploring into the 19th century?
Absolutely. And I love that example. I mean, first of all, what can one ever say about Abraham Lincoln? He's a bit of a show off, right? I mean, a genius his whole life. So already then in that sort of maiden political speech, the first one we have at any great length in his life, as a young man, he is so aware of these kinds of things. So as you say, he emphasizes the bodily presence and the fact that it's fast diminishing of veterans of the Revolution. And he reflects there a crisis of memory in American culture at the time, which is exactly that we are losing the bodily presence. As one observer said, we're losing the statues in human flesh, those physical props of memory of the Revolution. And what are we to do? Well, one of the things that then happens in that era that Lincoln's talking about is that as we have fewer and fewer veterans, and if we could pull up the demography slide, thank you so much. One of the things I did here is I looked at what I call the demography of death. And to describe the slide here, I took 120 randomly chosen, a little bit of a story how I'm confident that's a pretty good random group, but randomly chosen officers who'd been in the American Revolution of all ranks, including relatively low-ranking officers. And then 120 rank and file veterans. And all of these are people who survived the war, these two cohorts. If you graph them against each other like this by the year of their death, not surprisingly, if you think about the basic demography that underlies this, the officers tended to be older, right, to begin with. And of course, there were fewer officers. In that sense, this is deceptive. We're giving the officers a little more due in the population than they would have, because there wasn't actually an even number of both. But even if you put these even cohorts against each other, as you move toward 1840, which is where my story crescendos, you get this scissors effect, right, that you're seeing in the data there. And it actually, in practice, has a very pronounced consequence, which is that as you're getting down to the very last veterans, the last living statues of human flesh, from the Revolution, in an average village, by 1840, you maybe have one or two of these people left. And they are almost inevitably, I mean, by my best efforts to calculate it, even if you talk about officers of any rank at all, it's about 20-1 odds that the last, leaves of the tree, to use Hone's line in a poem from the era of when Lincoln was speaking, the last leaves of the Revolutionary tree are going to be privates. They're going to be enlisted men. And as George Bancroft said at the time, all of a sudden these guys find themselves carted about, he said, until their bones are ready to fall off. And many of them were bewildered because no one had cared for years that they were in the Revolution. After all, they were just privates, and lots of people held that rank. But as we lose that generation and they are the last ones left, all of a sudden people now see them, as these props, physical props of the memory of the Revolution, and particularly as we have this physicalist view of memory. I mean, people are going to remark on how important they are. And it's not coincidental that in the same period we get monument building, because they're going to say, as we lose the last ones, we have to replace them with other, physical centers of attraction. But this is very important because this unintentionally, I mean, no one's, sort of conspiring here, but this demography ends up opening up the memory of the American Revolution, ends up effectively, incidentally, yet powerfully democratizing it. because all of a sudden now people care about the Band of Brothers. I'm older than you are, Kevin. So when I was a kid, I would read books about World War II all the time. And looking back, I'm astonished because in the 70s, all the books were about MacArthur, Eisenhower. I mean, it was if they fought the war without the troops. The troops were just like, pieces on a Risk board game or something that they just moved around at will. In the 90s, when I was first, heading off to graduate school, that's when you get Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation. That's when you get, HBO's The Band of Brothers, where a similar thing is going on. The last survivors of the war, and even today, certainly this is true with the very last survivors, almost all of them are enlisted men for similar reasons. They're younger. There are more of them to begin with. And the memory shifts toward them. So all of a sudden in the 90s, people want to hear what average soldiers experienced. And it was almost, I can tell you, for people my age, it was almost a realization that, oh, yeah, the people who actually carried guns had something to do with winning the war. We should probably talk to them. Very similar thing happens in this period.
And it gives them a power, right? These veterans then have an ability to shape a story or to shape a narrative that had been closed off to them in the past. What do they do with it? Can you give us some examples of some of these surviving
veterans? Let's pull up the Ahmed slide. I think it's our next slide. This is my favorite example of what happens. All right. So this guy that you're seeing there, this is a self-portrait that he drew. He actually would draw these on little remittances where he would request his share of his Revolutionary War pension, because this fellow, Ahmed was his name, is going to be a pensioner in Middletown, Connecticut in the 1830s. He was a drummer in the American Revolution, and he's African American. And he is a fascinating person. I mean, he's absolutely flamboyant in so many ways. He becomes a local, celebrity, whether people like it or not. He loves the attention. And Ahmed, you can see over and over and over again, Ahmed uses this moment in which suddenly people care about rank and file veterans of the revolution to promote himself as a living link, as a keystone to understanding the revolution correctly. And he is going to have, as you can see on the upper left there, and at the bottom, both of these are actually from him. These are different portions of a cache of Washington's hair that he said that the Washington family had given him. He actually, it's a complicated backstory, but he claimed to not only have fought in the revolution, which he certainly did, but he claimed also at one point to have been, his term, a servant of the Washingtons. And, I think if we talk to Mary Thompson, she would tell us, I know she would, the evidence that he was a servant of the Washingtons isn't very good necessarily, although there are always complexities, right? It's hard to prove the absence of something. But in any case, this is the story he told. And I'll throw something in here. I assumed for a long time, I didn't hold this against him because he was, living in a tough world, living by his wits here. But I thought, that these almost had to be not really locks of Washington's hair. They had to be, trickery must have been involved. And then I discovered that one of the heirs of Washington, whose father I can show, had a cache of Washington's hair, went to school in Middletown, Connecticut. And if you look at the image closely in the center, you see that burial ground there next to the road. Ahmed, I was able to show his house. You can actually see it on the map there. It's in the southwest corner of that burial ground. And I covered this up to the right where his picture is there that he drew of himself. But Wesleyan University is right there. And before that campus was Wesleyan University, it was a military academy for boys. And one of the Washington heirs went there. And you actually have some of this guy's letters in your archives and the autograph letters. And he gave money to Ahmed in a time of crisis for Ahmed. I was able to find the receipts for this. So he ends up becoming a very plausible, as his dad certainly had these, source of actual locks of Washington's hair. In other words, this might be the real deal, which I think it's a remarkable story in any case, because notice too how Ahmed emphasizes his own hair here. And this isn't just, I'm not just reading out of this, all right? By all accounts, he loved to wear his hair flamboyantly in a quote unquote African way. he was a bold man, and in spite of the fact that there was an American colonization society, in Middletown in the period in Connecticut there that wanted to take people like him and ship them, quote unquote, back to Africa. Terrible characterization all around. Ahmed refuses to go, and he sees himself, as a true founder who has as much acclaim to not only live in America, but to be a figure in the American body politic as George Washington. And he makes that abundantly clear. And he emphasizes his own hair. He ends up marrying this white woman, which is kind of a daring move culturally. And she worries so much about how flamboyant his hair is and the difference between them, in this period where people are looking at these things, that she tries to dye her hair to look more like his at one point. At another point, she cuts his hair off, and supposedly while he's sleeping. I mean, there are shades of the Samson thing, but even that potentially has an ethnic racial aspect to it if it's a trope in the records. But it's astonishing. He's really clearly telling a story, where he is not ashamed of any aspect of himself. He's proud to be African, and he's proud to be American. He was actually born in Africa, by the way, and came over before the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And he's proud of all of it. He really bespeaks what W.D. Du Bois famously called the two-ness of being African American, and he owns both halves of that. He's a fascinating guy, and he was all into his identity as a Revolutionary War soldier.
There's another part of the story, Keith, that I don't want to lose a chance to dive into with you. That the demographic slide that you showed us, and really just the broad idea that the rank and file will outlive the officers, allows for something else to happen that you describe in the book as a sort of reinterpretation of the religiosity of the founding.
Absolutely.
And so tell us a little bit about that. How does that happen, and why does the demographics of the officer soldier divide factor in?
Very good. If we could, let's go back to the Ahmed slide there, because the bottom portion there, that particular part of Ahmed's stash of Washington's hair, he gave to Charles Downing, who was a divinity student. He gave it to him. Ahmed gave it to Downing in 1840. And Downing was a divinity student at what was then Wesleyan University, still is actually, at that location. And Ahmed lived, just a few feet really from the main campus. And Downing, of course, was, since this is Wesleyan University, I mean, Downing was a Methodist, and he was a Protestant, And the president of Wesleyan at the time, Wilbur Fisk, actually spoke up when Ahmed gave Washington's hair away and said, essentially, Ahmed is not being a good enough keeper of these important, relics of George Washington, the father of the country, that he's parceling this out too much. Now, the reason I key in on this and the way this relates to the rise of evangelical, eventually myth-making about the founding is this, that Fisk, the guy who speaks up against this trafficking, you might say, in the hair, he is obsessed with rebutting Catholic interest in saints' relics. I mean, Fisk goes on just before this, Ahmed gives the hair to one of Fisk's students. Fisk goes to Europe. He writes this florid, travelogue where he talks about memory theory, just the very kind we're talking about, local memory theory. And he talks about how, Catholics in Europe, he says, are idolatrous, is the way he sees it, popish, all that kind of rhetoric, in collecting relics of saints. And he says, it's wrong to do that. But even when he's in Europe, he is interested in trying even there to find relics related to the American Revolution, for example, related to Lafayette. And in the United States then, too, he becomes very interested in relics of the founding fathers at historical societies and so forth. And then, of course, in this instance, he speaks up directly about Washington's hair. And it's fascinating because I think it bespeaks several things. One is, again, that this memory theory is going to provide cover for Protestants to go all in venerating, the founding fathers. And the other thing is, notice the fact that while Fisk, the president of Wesleyan University, complains that Ahmed is doling this stuff out, Downing nonetheless takes the hair, when it's offered to him. And I would point to that as an example of how evangelical culture in the period, and to some extent now as well, but certainly in that period, coming off of or in the midst really of the awakenings. We talk about the Second Great Awakening, and people talk about Cane Creek, in the first decade of the 19th century. But really, the awakenings extend, you might say, from 1790 to about 1840, what Mark Knoll called the evangelical surge. The country becomes much more evangelical in that half century. And evangelicals coming through the awakenings are going to become a self-authorizing group. In other words, they take pride in every person interpreting scripture for themselves, drawing their own theological conclusions, authorizing, again, their own theology. And so as much as Downing admires Fisk, who says, Ahmed shouldn't be giving away locks of Washington's hair, it's too precious, Downing, in a sense, can do what he wants as long as his conscience allows him to as an evangelical. And so he takes the hair. And more largely, evangelicals in this period are going to begin to marry two things. And I want to stress something. I think they're going to do it, for the most part, very innocently. In other words, there's no conspiracy underway. But what's happening is that as evangelicals are more dominant, as they certainly are in American culture in the 50 years after the Constitutional Convention, as they're accepted in America, and as they love America in this period that we're talking about of intense popular nostalgia for the Revolution and founding, they increasingly tend to assume, which I think you can imagine that they would, that the two things they love the most, evangelicalism and their people, their churches, that they are of a piece with this story of the Revolution and founding. And they're going to assume increasingly that George Washington must have been an evangelical. Never mind the fact that, we can only find in his voluminous writings that he mentions, Jesus directly about 3 times. He's a rabid providentialist. And Mary Thompson's written a wonderful book on what he did believe, as best we can tell. He was a rather reticent soul. But evangelicals are going to come to believe that the founders, not just Washington, but the founders in general, must have been evangelicals. Now, Mark Knoll, I mentioned him before, he's a brilliant scholar of early America and of religion. In my opinion, he's offered the most serviceable summary of the real story about evangelicals in the Revolution. Knoll has said that the top tier of founders, people that you would recognize as founders, but the most elite within that elite group, were almost none of them were evangelicals. So we're talking about people basically in danger of becoming president of the United States. Franklin didn't get there, but he could have been. And he was not an evangelical. He talked about his materialism, especially late in his life, and he joked, to their chagrin with evangelicals that he didn't really know if Jesus was divine, but he would find out, at his death, which he expected soon. And then you go down the line. George Washington, I've already mentioned how reticent he was really to talk, directly about Jesus, particularly for a man in the 18th century, my goodness. And then you look at, the second president, John Adams. Adams at one point is going to, in writing to Jefferson, and, they have that falling out and then they get back together, in the last years of their life. One of the things that draws them together, I think, clearly, if you read through their correspondence, not the only thing, but is their shared humor in making fun of the evangelical surge and making fun of the evangelicals for being over the top in their religious confidences, particularly in the historicity of the passion of Christ, the idea of his death, burial, resurrection, and deity. So Adams is going to write to Jefferson, for example, and say that Adams, finds it ridiculous to think that God would come to this little ball earth to be spit upon by Jews. He just thinks the incarnation is absurd. Jefferson writes in that epistolary exchange that it's only the deliria of crazy imaginations that would ascribe, divinity to Jesus. And they both make fun of John Jay, because Jay was sort of lesser founder. He wasn't going to be president of the United States. And obviously, he was important with his work with
Yeah.
the court and that kind of stuff. But as a politician, maybe not quite as successful. And they're going to make fun of him because he writes a book about biblical prophecy. He takes this stuff seriously. All of which bespeaks, again, what I think is the most serviceable generalization, the one that comes from Mark Knoll. Knoll says the most elite of the founders tended to be the least evangelical. And it was really the second tier, people like John Jay, Elias Boudinot, I mentioned, who are evangelicals generally. What's interesting is in the period that I'm looking at in the book, 1790 to 1840, during the evangelical surge, the evangelicals, you would think they would point to Elias Boudinot, John Jay, and celebrate their actual, Patrick Henry. I mean, these guys were evangelicals. But they themselves are not actually very familiar with those people. Like most people, the memory of the revolution was so vast. It would be exhausting to have an exhaustive, even today for most people, sense of it. So there are these icons, right? Washington, Adams, Jefferson. And they're going to simply assume, the evangelicals, that those people were evangelicals. And the proof for them is that they read the evidence innocently, but they read it essentially demographically backwards. And now to that point about demography, the last veterans who are left, as we've said in this period, are privates. They're former Revolutionary War privates. A lot of these guys, they're right in the demographic group, the sort of middling and lower classes who converted in this era to evangelical theology. And you can just find in one church after another, people are going to say, as they're speaking floridly about how the founders, the elite founders, must have been evangelicals, even Jefferson somehow. They're going to point to these godly privates, as veterans in their midst and say, look, this guy was in the revolution too. Yeah. He's an evangelical. What's really weird about this is on other days of the week, you can find the same people noticing that person converted well after the revolution during the revivals, but it all gets conflated. Yeah. And it leads to a myth, a sort of pious myth of the evangelical founding. And I think it haunts, evangelical understanding to this day. And I say that about, you might say, my people.
Yeah, no, this is great. Although I've noticed that we are telling a very masculine story thus far.
Yeah.
There's a lot to say about women in this period too. We actually saw a bit of it with Charles Wilson Peel. The people visiting his museum included women. But there's can you help us bring women into the story?
Let's bring up the last slide here. Last but definitely not least, I love this person. Emma Willard was a very important author and educator in this era. And beginning in the 1820s and 30s, she starts a female academy in Troy, New York. And she pioneers teaching about American history and particularly the Revolution and that heritage and American ideals to women. Now, very significantly, Emma Willard's mother is going to be involved, not as a soldier, but she's going to be involved, on the home front in supporting the American Revolution. And she dies in the middle of Emma Willard's crusade in this era, to teach women about the founding. And Willard is going to actually write about how her mother illustrates the combination of imperatives in this era, that we have, the emphasis on physicality, again, of memory of the American Revolution. Willard is all into this, and she applies this in education. She says you have to have physical objects to teach the revolution. But the women who were in the revolution, like her mother, are increasingly dying. Her mother dies in 1840. And so Willard says, what are we to do to promote the memory of the revolution? She says, well, think about this. Mothers, certainly this is true in that culture, are disproportionately in physical contact with children during their years of nurture. And if in fact memory is communicated, through physical instantiations and physical experiences, through sensate understanding, then she says it falls disproportionately by the very nature of the logistics to mothers to teach the memory of the revolution. And she and many other women are going to point toward to Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother. There's this huge push in the period to build a monument, which does eventually end up getting built, to Mary Ball Washington. And many of the supporters of that, including many women, are going to assert that Mary Ball Washington had, by her physical proximity to George Washington, given that memory is, again, physically conveyed in a sensate way, had been the one who put into his memory important principles of, justice and truth and goodness and even religious faith. And they're going to say the country has to educate girls who will then become mothers, because logistically, by the science of memory, they are going to be best positioned to drive this into the rising generation. And she was an amazing teacher. She emphasized, the sensate approach. She emphasized local memory. Her students, as you can see in this image in 1890, built this statue to her, which still exists in Troy, New York. And if you look on the right-hand side there, that's actually a lock of Martha Washington's hair at the top, George's at the bottom, that one of her students collected, consistent with this emphasis. So this shift ends up opening up the memory of the Revolution for women who seize the opportunity, for African Americans, for average veterans, whole different demographic than we're seeing in the days of Peel and the first historical societies.
Keith, this has been fascinating. We've only got a few minutes left, and I want to actually take us to historic sites and museums today. So as you look at this history, and we started with Charles Wilson Peel, as you said, the first American museum. And of course, you've spent a lot of your time doing research at historical societies and at places like Mount Vernon, historic sites. Tammy, actually from the audience, asked a question about the use of period costumes and historical interpreters to better convey the past and to connect people to it. What do you see when you look at historic sites and historical societies and museums today that seems to be shaped by this history? Can you
I love that question, right? Because at this point, I'm going to, essentially editorialize, right? At some point, you interpret your evidence. And what I think all of this speaks to is essentially what I would call the human hunger for incarnation. You know what I mean? To be in each other's presence. I think we do want to physically connect with the history that matters to us, with the places and the people, and even in a sense, their forms physically. And yeah, costumes, all these things speak to that. I think we can all, look at ourselves during the pandemic and say, many of us have felt the loss of that physical nearness to people that we care about. And so in a sense, I would almost come full circle. I started the project to try to get away from an anthropological view of memory that essentializes memory. I wanted to look at how memory itself is understood, in the time period, change over time. And it is tacking in this physicalist direction. And yet I do think that, if you look across the human history that we know, the ages that are recorded, it is typically human, I think, to want this kind of connection. So I applaud, museums, these institutions that preserve these things. I personally would never want to own a lock of Washington's hair that I thought was the real thing, because I would feel a sense of responsibility, not because there's some talismanic significance, or because we're going to torture some scientific insights out of it someday with, DNA or something, but just because it does have that value to be evocative. And I wouldn't want it to get, lost on the surface of my desk or something.
Well, as you said, Mount Vernon has about 60 of these locks of hair, so we can certainly take good care of them for you, Keith, and nothing will happen.
Appreciate
it. Keith Beutler, who's got a great new book, George Washington's Hair: How Early Americans Remembered the Founders. Thanks so much, Keith. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everybody, and we will see you again next time. Happy George Washington's birthday, one day late, and thank you to one and all. Have a great night.